One of the biggest lessons we learned from the Bahrain race this year was the fact that the fight for fifth in the championship is wide open. The top four teams are quite clear in Red Bull, Ferrari, Aston Martin and Mercedes, but all the other teams have an opportunity to get the best of the rest spot in 2023. This means that teammate battles will be more important than ever this season, so let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. An unexpectedly close 2023 season. There was a big surprise in Bahrain. Despite the fact that Red Bull seemed to have extended their lead from last season, the rest of the team seemed to have created one of the most competitive lineups in recent times. Traditionally, whenever there's a significant regulation change, the first couple of seasons are not all that competitive. You generally have a team that's got their initial concept right, and then it takes time for other teams to develop their own concept to compete, or to copy elements of the lead team car's design to bring them up to speed. In a non-cost-capped environment, the lead team tended to be one of the top teams that would spend their way into the distance, and it may well be the case that this still happens with Red Bull this year despite their aerodynamic testing penalty for exceeding the cost cap in 2021. Plus, with the cost-capped environment that we're now in, the top teams might not be able to develop their cars as much as they would have been able to do previously. The qualifying gaps in Bahrain were significantly lower than they were in 2022 though. The gap between first and last in Q1 last season was 2.1 seconds, and this year that same gap was just 1.2 seconds. As I said in my 5 things we learned after the Bahrain Grand Prix, this might be due to the fact that the teams had a better understanding of their cars this year given they tended to be evolutions of last season and they've had 3 days of testing to hone their setups. However, this smaller gap is still unexpected when you consider the nature of the competitiveness of regulation changes of the past. In the race, it was clear that the Red Bull team was the strongest by a country mile, but behind them, the order is still somewhat unknown. The Aston Martin of Fernando Alonso was faster than the Mercedes cars and even comfortably overtook the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz. Similarly, Lance Stroll managed to split the Mercedes drivers on his way to 6th, so there seems to be 3 competitive teams behind the Red Bulls, and there's a chance that when F1 goes to different types of circuits, each of these teams may be able to get closer to the top. Behind the new top 4 teams this season is looking highly competitive. Every team managed to get at least one driver into Q2 in Bahrain, which shows the level of competitiveness in the midfield pack is higher than ever. It remains unclear which team is at the back of the order right now, with McLaren currently sitting 10th in the standings after a dreadful performance, including a retirement for Piastri and another power unit related issue for Norris, resulting in the driver stopping 6 times. However, there have been signs that the McLaren car might not be quite that far behind the rest of the drivers based on the fact that they've been able to get more competitive times in Bahrain in practice sessions, and they may find themselves more competitive as the season goes on as well. Other teams, like Williams, were highly impressive in Bahrain. The team that has had a turbulent off-season has found themselves with a new team principal who only arrived in February, so for a few months the team were without both FX de Maison and Jos Capito in charge. But that doesn't seem to have slowed them down too much. Williams were the worst performing team in qualifying, but were still competitive in the race, ending up 10th and 12th at the checkered flag. This performance was one of the most surprising from the race in Bahrain. The team didn't look too competitive in testing, but they were able to be right in the midfield pack in the race. If they can keep these kinds of performances up, then they'll be a great indicator that the new financial and aerodynamic regulations are working. So the whole order seems to be more competitive, and this is great for the racing, but it means even more for the teammate battles up and down the order, and to stay tuned into those teammate battles, make sure you subscribe to Behind the Drive to hear the latest this season. Teammate battles are more important in 2023. So with the order more competitive, there's even more pressure and weight on the driver's shoulders for each team to deliver. This is because the driver's influence on the car's performance is greater when the cars are all closer up and down the order. This was apparent in Bahrain. In qualifying, the 5 cars eliminated in Q1 were from 5 different teams. This implies that while we may have one single dominant team at the front of the order, things are far more competitive further back, and there isn't a single team that is well behind the rest of the setups on the grid like we had with Williams last season. For me, I think Bahrain exposed 4 driver partnerships that are new for this year that could show the fact that teammates have significant influences on the performance of the car this year. These include the AlphaTauri pairing. Yuki Tsunoda and Nick de Vries are a new pair, and there's a lot of pressure on Tsunoda's shoulders to perform this season. It's known that Tsunoda is a fan of this track. In his 2 seasons in Formula 1 so far, he's managed to score points in Bahrain on both occasions. Once again, the Japanese driver performed well, qualifying 14th to de Vries' 19th. This difference is significant and it sets the tone for what could be a competitive year for these two drivers as they fight to prove that they're capable of being ready for the Red Bull seat if that chance arises. In the race, the pair were closer, with Tsunoda finishing 11th to De Vries's 14th. It'll be an interesting battle all year, and it's potentially just a coincidence that Tsunoda was the better performing driver at one of his preferred circuits. It could also be the case that he may be the stronger driver all season. It's certainly one to watch when the midfield is this competitive. In the McLaren, there was a big difference in the two drivers. Norris qualified P11 to Piastri's 18th. This difference is understandable given the large experience gap between the two. However, the gap in qualifying time in Q1 between them was around 4.5 tenths of a second, a significant gap that had huge consequences on the position that they started the race in. It's another sign that the driver can have a big influence on the car's position in 2023, and arguably more so than in previous seasons. Of course, for McLaren, these qualifying results had very little impact on the racing itself, as I mentioned earlier. The pair ended up right at the back of the order, but as the season goes on, I think it could be interesting to see how far apart these two drivers may be. Alpine are a team with a new driver lineup in Ocon and Gasly, and there's a lot of anticipation over these two drivers. Ocon is established in the team, and Gasly comes in with a decent amount of pressure on his shoulders after he failed to move into the Red Bull setup back in 2019. The pair were the furthest apart of any team on the grid, with Gasly last and Ocon 9th in qualifying. This is obviously a huge difference, and perhaps was Ocon laying down a marker for what may be to come this season. However, things couldn't have been more different in the race, as Gasly progressed up the order well to secure points for the team, and Ocon had a dreadful race which included 3 independent penalties, for being out of position at the start, for speeding in the pit lane, and for his team working on the car before a penalty was served. This driver pairing is going to be quite close this year in my opinion, and I think that as Gasly gets more comfortable in the car, we could see them both performing well in that Alpine. The final driver pairing I want to highlight is the new pair at Williams. Alex Albon is expected to be the stronger driver against the rookie of Logan Sargent. Sargent is the least experienced driver on the grid, but he performed admirably in Bahrain and he didn't look out of place at all. Sargent only just failed to make it out of Q1, and he was only one position behind Albon on the grid, which was one of the closest positions of any driver pair on the grid in Bahrain. In the race, the pair were very competitive and ended up 10th and 12th, with Albon leading the way. I was surprised at how close these two drivers were in the race, and I hope it continues as that Williams car has the potential to be competitive this season, especially if both drivers can keep this performance up. So the performances in Bahrain were interesting to observe. Of course, it's just the first race of the year, and a lot can and will change between now and the end of the season, particularly as teams with larger budgets tend to develop their cars faster. But what we do know is that this season the drivers are going to have more of an influence on the racing, and with the close pack and the new regulations allowing for more competitive battles on track, we could be in for one of the best seasons yet.